The night of the Haverley masquerade was meant to be one of splendor and renewal. Yet beneath its chandeliers and chandeliers' glittering light, cruelty found its most eloquent stage. Rain had followed the carriages from Pall Mall to the countryside, leaving the manor's marble steps slick with mud. Lanterns swung in the wind as if nervous for what the night would bring. Within, music floated through perfumed air, a waltz in perfect rhythm, guiding men and women wrapped in silk and arrogance. London's elite gathered not merely to celebrate spring, but to reassure themselves that their power was intact. Every glance, every whisper was a negotiation of pride. She stood at the threshold of that golden room, trembling slightly as she removed her damp gloves. The borrowed gown, pale lavender and modestly cut, clung to her slender form in the candlelight. Its hem, slightly frayed, betrayed the truth she had worked so hard to hide. She did not belong here. Yet she entered, because she had been told by Lady Pembroke herself that her service was appreciated enough to merit an evening's pleasure. She had spent the day teaching arithmetic to the lady's children, and now stood, a guest among employers, pupils, and strangers. Eyes followed her. First curious, then amused, she tried to ignore them, her chin lifted just enough to suggest confidence. When the orchestra began another waltz, she accepted a polite invitation from a young lieutenant with a nervous smile. For 3 short minutes, she felt the air lighten, the music, the movement, the illusion that perhaps she could pass as one of them. But illusions are fragile things. It began with a whisper near the refreshment table. A lady in sapphire silk leaned toward her companion and murmured, "Do you see the governess?" How quaint that she should dance without being paid. Laughter, sharp and controlled, rippled outward like wine spilled on white linen. Her partner's smile faltered. The lieutenant cleared his throat, offered an awkward bow, and excused himself before the final turn. Alone in the center of the floor, she felt the room tighten around her, chandeliers glaring down like judges. The musicians faltered briefly. Even they sensed the shift. She stepped back, head low, pretending to adjust her glove. A gentleman brushed past her without apology. Every whispered word grew louder in her mind. Governess, impostor, poor thing. The warmth that had filled her chest moments before turned to something colder, heavier. Across the ballroom, near the grand fireplace, a tall figure watched her in silence. The Duke of Ravenscroft, known for his unbending reserve and the sorrow that hung about him like a mourning veil. His presence commanded attention, though he sought none. Broad-shouldered, dressed in black without ornament, he seemed carved from shadow itself. Since the tragedy that claimed his wife and child 3 winters past, he had withdrawn from the life of society. He did not dance, did not smile, did not attend to the flattery of women. Yet tonight, as the governess stood humiliated among pearls and powdered grace, his gaze did not waver. Lady Pembroke approached him with the easy confidence of rank. "She overstepped, Your Grace," she said softly, fanning herself though the air was cold. "One must remember one's place." He turned to her, his eyes a shade too sharp for politeness. "Indeed, my lady. And yet I often find it difficult to know where that place begins or ends in such a room as this." Lady Pembroke's fan stilled. She murmured something inaudible and retreated toward a safer cluster of guests. The governess, meanwhile, had fled the dance floor. She found refuge behind a column near an open terrace where the wind carried in rain and the scent of wet lilacs. Her breath came unevenly. She pressed her gloved hand to her chest as though to keep it from breaking through. Behind her the violins resumed, indifferent. Laughter rose again as if the cruelty had never happened. And then a voice, low, steady, unexpected, came from the shadows beside her. "You dropped this," she turned. The Duke stood there, holding out a silk handkerchief embroidered with the Ravenscroft crest. The rain at his shoulders glimmered in the candlelight. For a moment she could not speak. The nearness of him, the quiet weight of his presence, seemed unreal. "I thank you, Your Grace," she managed. Taking it with trembling fingers, he studied her, not the gown, not the pearls, but her eyes. "You should not let them see you wounded," he said, almost gently. "They feed on the smallest tear." She looked down. "It is difficult, when one has been invited to be mocked." "Then take comfort," he replied. They mock because they are afraid. You possess something they cannot measure, a dignity they mistake for pride." His words startled her. No one had ever spoken to her like that, least of all a man of his standing. Before she could answer, a servant appeared at the terrace door. "Your Grace, the carriage awaits." The Duke inclined his head slightly toward her, then turned to leave. But before stepping into the rain, he paused and said quietly, "Do not return to them. Let the night end with your head high." Then he was gone, swallowed by the mist and the distant rumble of wheels. She remained still, the handkerchief clutched against her heart. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Behind her, the ballroom continued its glittering deceit. Yet the echo of his voice lingered, warm and unsettling. When she finally left, the storm had passed. The air outside was heavy with silence. The driver who brought her back to Lady Pembroke's townhouse said nothing. He had seen tears before, and this was no different. But as she stepped out beneath the gaslight, she overheard 2 footmen gossiping by the gate. "They say the Duke never dances any more," one murmured. "Not since his lady and the child went down in the lake. Some say he blames himself." She stopped, the words catching in her chest. The handkerchief felt suddenly heavy in her palm. The man who had spoken to her with such strange kindness carried grief deeper than her shame could ever reach. She imagined him standing alone at that black lake, year after year, haunted by what could not be undone. Inside her small attic room, she laid the handkerchief upon the table and lit a single candle. The fabric caught the glow, the crest gleaming faintly like a secret oath. She should have wept again, but she did not. Instead, she sat at her window, watching the rain return, soft, deliberate, endless. In that quiet, she made herself a promise. She would not let the world define her worth. The laughter of the wealthy might echo through their halls, but it could not reach where her dignity had taken root. And yet, as she blew out the candle, she knew something irrevocable had changed. Kindness, once offered by a man who had sworn never to feel again, was a dangerous thing. It did not fade with the morning. It lingered like a note of music unresolved, a question left unanswered, and as dawn began to pale over London, she realized with a shiver that she had not merely been humiliated that night. She had been seen. Dawn crept slow over the gray horizon, washing the Thames Valley in a pale, sorrowful light. The governess awoke before the rest of the house, as she always did, her hands red from the morning's cold water and her thoughts still restless from the night of the masquerade. A week had passed, yet the memory refused to loosen its hold. The laughter, the eyes, the Duke's quiet voice like a calm over a storm. She had folded his handkerchief neatly into the pages of her worn prayer book, meaning to return it when the world felt less cruel. But no such moment came. The Pembroke children's laughter carried faintly down the corridor as she prepared their lessons. She drew chalk on the board, numbers, names of constellations, small pieces of order against the chaos of her own heart. It was then that a knock sounded upon the schoolroom door, soft yet deliberate. Mrs. Hollins, the housekeeper, entered with a letter sealed in ivory wax. "For you." "Miss," she said, her tone sharpened by curiosity. Delivered by a footman wearing the Ravenscroft crest, the governess hesitated. No one ever wrote to her. Her name was a thing rarely inked, even on her own possessions. She thanked Mrs. Hollins and waited until the woman left before breaking the seal. Inside lay a single white camellia pressed between folded pages, still fragrant, its petals ghostly against the paper. Beneath it, in handwriting she recognized even before reading, were the words, "For the courage you showed in silence." Her breath caught. No further explanation, no signature beyond that single initial. She touched the camellia with reverence, half fearing it might crumble beneath her fingers. The simplicity of the gesture struck her harder than any bouquet or jewel ever could. Yet before she could hide it away, a small voice broke her reverie. "Miss, is that from a gentleman?" asked little Charlotte Pembroke, standing in the doorway with her curls undone. The governess smiled faintly, flustered, and shook her head. From a friend, nothing more. But by luncheon, the servants were whispering. Mrs. Hollins had seen the flower, and the butler had told Lady Pembroke, who entered the schoolroom that afternoon with the kind of smile that cuts deeper than words. "Ravenscroft writes to you, does he?" Lady Pembroke began, pacing lightly across the rug. "I had not realized the Duke had turned his attention to governesses. How?" "Charitable of him." The governess lowered her eyes. "It was but a note of kindness, my lady." "Nothing more. Kindness?" Lady Pembroke's tone grew colder. "Do you know how the world interprets such things? A woman of your station receiving private correspondence from a man of his rank? You invite scandal without even trying." The governess stood very still, the chalk trembling slightly in her hand. "Then let them speak," she said softly. "I have endured worse words than theirs." Lady Pembroke's expression hardened. "If I am to protect my household's name, I must act prudently. You will not attend supper this evening, nor will you leave this house without my permission." The order struck like a blow, yet the governess merely bowed. When the door closed behind her employer, she allowed herself a single tear, quiet, untraceable, before wiping it away. She folded the letter and hid it within her bodice, close to her heart. At Ravenscroft Hall, the Duke faced his own reckoning. His brother, Lord Julian, had arrived uninvited, bringing with him the scent of tobacco and disdain. "Another letter." "Edmund?" Julian asked, glancing at the remaining sheets on the Duke's desk. "If you mean to ruin yourself, at least choose a lady with dowry and pedigree." Edmund Ravenscroft leaned back in his chair, fatigue etched into the corners of his eyes. "You mistake compassion for indulgence," he replied evenly. Julian snorted. "Compassion? The world calls it foolishness. You've lost enough. Must you now trade your title for pity?" The Duke rose, walking to the window. Beyond the frost-flecked glass lay the fields that once sustained his estate. His debts, mounting since the tragedy, had become public talk. The Crown had begun inquiries into his finances. Even Parliament whispered of his decline. Yet none of it weighed upon him as heavily as the memory of that girl standing humiliated among the jeweled elite. "She did nothing to deserve their cruelty," he said at last. "And if a flower is all I can offer in defiance of it, then let them call it folly." Julian shook his head. "They'll do worse than that. They'll say you've lost your reason." "Then perhaps I have," Edmund murmured. Days passed before he saw her again. The occasion arose by coincidence, or so society would claim. The Duke had come to call upon Lord Pembroke regarding a parcel of land adjoining their estates. The governess was in the garden, teaching the children their Latin verbs beneath a bare oak tree. She wore no finery, no jewels, only a simple gray cloak drawn close against the wind. Her voice was soft but firm, patient as she corrected the boy's pronunciation. When she looked up and saw him standing by the gate, she froze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then, with the smallest inclination of his head, he greeted her. "Good morning, miss," he said, his voice quieter than the wind. "Your Grace," she replied, eyes lowered. "You received my letter?" "I did." She hesitated, then added, "It was not wise of you." "Perhaps not," he said, "but it was honest." He could see how her hands tightened on the child's book, how the corners of her mouth trembled between gratitude and fear. Before either could say more, Lady Pembroke's carriage rounded the drive. She stepped out with deliberate grace, her expression composed, but her gaze sharp. "Your Grace," she greeted coolly. "How very unexpected," he bowed. "I came on business." "Indeed," she said, glancing toward the governess, though some might suspect otherwise. The insult hung between them like a drawn blade. The Duke did not flinch. "The world suspects much, Lady Pembroke. It is its favorite pastime." She offered a thin smile and turned away. When she had gone, the governess whispered, "You mustn't come here again. It will only worsen things for you." He looked at her, his eyes a shade of storm-dark gray. "Do not concern yourself with my reputation, miss. It is already in ruins." And then he left her there, the scent of rain rising from the soil, her heart pounding with a confusion she dared not name. That evening, as she sat alone in her attic, a knock sounded. Mrs. Hollins entered, nervous and wide-eyed. "There's talk," she whispered. "They say His Grace faces inquiry in Parliament, that he may lose his estate. The governess felt the air thin. The camellia, now wilted in her book, seemed to hold its breath. "Then," she said softly, "he has already lost enough." She turned toward the window, where the first drops of rain struck the glass. Somewhere beyond the city, Ravenscroft. Hall stood waiting, and with it a man too proud to beg and too broken to forget. And though the world would name their connection scandal, what had begun as pity now felt dangerously close to something else, something neither prayer nor propriety could restrain. The storm came down from the north, like a vengeful god, sweeping through the moors and swallowing the last gold of sunset in its black mouth. The wind tore at the trees, bending them low, and the chapel bell, long disused, tolled once before the rope snapped in two. She had walked 5 miles through the rain to reach this lonely stone refuge, her cloak heavy with water, her boots sinking into the mud with every trembling step. Her dismissal had come that morning, swift and unceremonious. Lady Pembroke's words still echoed in her mind. "I will not have my household made the subject of rumor. You are to leave by nightfall." So she had left. No destination, no plan. Only the need to breathe air untainted by scorn. The chapel, she remembered, had belonged once to the Ravenscroft estate, built decades ago when the family was still whole. It stood on a hill overgrown with ivy and wild rose, its roof half collapsed, its altar draped in dust. Yet, to her, it was sanctuary, and something more. She had come here once before, years ago, when she was still a teacher's apprentice. Then a small boy had wandered in with a wooden horse clutched in his hand. The Duke's son. She had led him home before the storm came. That was before the drowning, before the silence that fell upon Ravenscroft like a curse. Now, as thunder rolled over the hills, she pushed open the chapel door and stepped inside. Rainwater streamed down her face, mingling with tears she no longer had strength to hide. The air was thick with damp stone and memory. She knelt at the old pew, whispering a prayer she did not believe. When the door creaked behind her, she froze. A tall figure filled the entrance, rain dripping from his coat, his presence as steady as the storm was wild. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood there, breathing hard from the wind, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You should not be here," she said, rising to her feet. "Nor should you," he replied, his voice carrying the calm of command even now. "The roads are near impassable. What drove you to walk through this weather?" "I had nowhere else to go." Something in the honesty of that answer struck him. He stepped forward, closing the door against the wind. The silence that followed was dense, intimate, the kind that leaves no refuge for pretense. "They dismissed you," he said, not as a question. "They did. For your letter." He exhaled, half a sigh, half a curse. "Then I have ruined you." "You have shown me kindness," she corrected softly. "It is not the same thing." His gaze lifted to the shattered stained glass window above the altar, remnants of saints bathed in moonlight. "Kindness," he murmured, a word too easily given and too often mistaken. He turned to her again, the lamplight catching the silver at his temples. "You do not understand, miss. Every act of mercy I offer turns against me. Every hand I try to steady slips away. My wife, my child." He stopped, his voice breaking for the first time in years. The confession hung in the air, fragile and raw. She moved closer, hesitating only a moment before saying, "You carry their ghosts as though grief were penance. But you did not take their lives." He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Did I not? I sent them to the lake house that day to wait for me. I was late. A broken carriage wheel, nothing more. When I arrived, the storm had already come. They found the boat overturned, the child's toy horse floating near the reeds." She looked at him then, truly looked, at the tremor in his hands, the exhaustion in his eyes, the hollow carved deep beneath his voice. "You have punished yourself enough, Your Grace." He stepped closer, until only a breath divided them. "And yet I cannot stop. because grief is all that is left of them. The rain hammered against the roof, water dripping through cracks to the floor. She could smell the storm on him, rain, earth, sorrow. Perhaps grief should not be kept alive, she whispered. Then what remains, if not grief? He asked. Forgiveness, she said. If not for them, then for yourself. He turned from her sharply, pacing before the altar. You speak as if forgiveness were a coin one could simply spend. You do not know what it is to lose everything. I know what it is to have nothing, she replied. That is its own kind of loss. Her words stopped him. He stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a governess or a symbol of scandal, but as a woman who had endured 1,000 small humiliations and still stood upright in the wreckage. I was wrong about you, he said quietly. You are not afraid of me. I was once, she admitted. The first night, when you offered me your handkerchief, I thought it mockery, pity from a man too far above me to understand shame. But now I see you are not above anything at all. You are buried in it. A silence stretched between them, thick as the storm. Then, almost involuntarily, he reached into his coat and drew out something wrapped in linen. He placed it on the altar and unfolded it, a small wooden horse, worn and broken, its paint long faded. I kept it, he said simply. I don't know why. Her eyes softened. Because it's all that remains of him. He nodded once. You are the only soul I have spoken to of this since it happened. Then why tell me now? Because you are the only one who would not pretend to understand. She stepped nearer, her hand trembling as it hovered above the wooden toy. Then, gathering courage, she looked into his eyes and said, You cannot live among ghosts, Your Grace. They will not forgive you until you forgive yourself. His jaw tightened. And if forgiveness means forgetting, then remember, she said, but live. The lightning flashed, illuminating the space between them, two souls suspended between ruin and redemption. He reached for her hand without thinking, his fingers cold and wet against hers. She did not pull away. If I could love again, he whispered, voice breaking on the words. It would ruin you. She met his gaze, steady, unflinching. Every wound in her made suddenly sacred by his confession. Then ruin me, Your Grace, he froze. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere outside, a horse neighed in the storm. He released her hand slowly, as if afraid of what might come next. You do not know what you ask, he said, almost pleading. I ask nothing, she replied. Only that you stop running from what is left of your heart. The rain eased, softening to a whisper. In that dim, broken chapel, something shifted. Not quite love, not yet, but something perilously close. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet, reverent. If the world learns you were here with me tonight, it will destroy you, she smiled faintly. The world has already tried. He bowed his head, as if in prayer, though no words came. Outside, the first light of dawn began to stir behind the storm clouds, pale and uncertain, yet undeniably there, and as he turned to leave, his cloak brushing her shoulder, she knew that whatever bound them now could no longer be undone by propriety or fear. It was something older, deeper, the kind of truth no storm could wash away. London bloomed in scandal that spring, though the blossoms themselves had not yet dared to open. The city's gossip sheets inked the Duke of Ravenscroft's name daily, always with pity at first, then with malice. They wrote of debts, of creditors gathering like vultures, of Parliament inquiries into his estate's decline. But by the third week the ink had turned darker, whispering of a woman, a governess dismissed in disgrace, seen walking near Ravenscroft's carriage at dusk. One column called her his fallen charity. Another named her his undoing. He read none of it. His butler burned the papers before dawn, though the servants still whispered behind doors. The Duke spent his mornings alone in the study, poring over accounts that refused to balance, his hands ink-stained and weary. At night he walked the long hall, where portraits of his ancestors stared down in judgment. The rain outside, it seemed, would not end. She, too, felt the city's cruelty in quieter ways. The boarding house where she'd found refuge after her dismissal had begun to cool toward her. Landladies do not like scandal in their rooms. It stains the sheets, the walls, even the rent money. Children she once taught now passed her in the street without greeting. London, generous in gossip and poor in mercy, was slowly erasing her, and yet one letter reached her still, unmarked but unmistakable. His hand. They intend to auction Ravenscroft Hall within the month. Come to the music room on Friday evening. There are matters I wish to settle before all is lost. She almost did not go. Pride and fear warred within her. But when Friday came, she found herself walking toward the grandest house on Grosvenor Square, its windows glowing faintly through the drizzle. Inside, music drifted, a gala in progress. The hallways shone with crystal and laughter, with guests too proud to notice their host's ruin. The governess entered quietly through a side door, led by an old servant who had once pitied her. The music room lay at the far end of the corridor, where she had once heard children's laughter years before. Now it was silent, save for the low hum of the orchestra beyond. He stood by the piano, half in shadow, his black coat immaculate, though his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "You came," he said. "I should not have." "No," he admitted. "You should not." For a moment neither spoke. Then he crossed to her, his expression unreadable, but his voice trembling with control. "I asked you here because I have nothing left to offer but truth." Her hands twisted the hem of her cloak. "Truth has ruined many before us. Then let it ruin us honestly." He took a breath, as if the next words might cost him more than coin. "I sent word to Parliament this morning. Ravenscroft Hall will be surrendered. What remains of my holdings will pay my debts, but not my name. That, too, they will strip from me." She stared at him, disbelief giving way to sorrow. "And yet you stand here as though it were a choice." "It was," he said. "The last one I'll ever make freely." She shook her head. "Why tell me this?" "Because I have lived in the company of ghosts long enough. I will not leave this world without having spoken what they could not." Her breath caught. "And what is that, your grace?" He stepped closer. The distance between them vanished, though propriety screamed at them both. "That the night in the chapel did not end for me. That I have thought of you every hour since. That in your silence I found peace I thought the grave had stolen." Her heart pounded so loudly she feared he could hear it. "Do not say this," she whispered. "Not now." "If not now," he said, "then never." "And I am done with never." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, the deed to his estate already signed away. "They may take everything, but they cannot dictate who I love." "Love?" The word fell from her lips like a prayer broken in disbelief. "Yes," he said. "Though I have no right to it, though it may damn you by association, I love you." Tears welled in her eyes, not of joy, but of the unbearable weight of it. "You mistake gratitude for love, compassion for salvation." He shook his head. "I have mistaken many things in my life, but not this." Voices echoed in the hallway, laughter, footsteps, the sound of a waltz beginning anew. Somewhere a door opened, and Lady Pembroke's sharp tones pierced the music. "He means to shame himself tonight. Dancing with a servant, I am told. A governess." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Then let them see it," he said. Before she could protest, he took her hand, not gently, not timidly, but as a man takes what he has already lost. He led her down the corridor and into the ballroom. Gasps rippled through the assembly like wind over tall grass. Every gaze turned. The music faltered. And there, under the light of 1,000 candles, the Duke of Ravenscroft stood beside the woman they called his ruin. He bowed to her with all the grace of his birth and said, "May I have this dance?" Her throat ached. "They will never forgive you." "Then let me earn their hatred properly." The orchestra hesitated, then obeyed his nod. The first notes of a slow waltz rose, fragile and trembling. Together they began to move, not as noble and servant, but as equals bound by defiance and grief. His hand rested at her waist, her fingers against his shoulder, and the world shrank to the sound of their steps. Around them, whispers swelled into outrage. A woman fainted. Lord Julian turned away in disgust. Yet the Duke did not waver. "You will lose everything," she murmured. "I have already lost it," he replied. "What remains is mine to give." When the final note faded, silence reigned. No applause, no words, only the stunned hush of society watching its own reflection crack. He turned to her then, his voice low, resolute. "They will write of this," he said. "They will call you many things. Do not let them take your name. And you?" she asked. He smiled faintly, tragic and calm. "They have already taken mine." For a heartbeat longer they stood beneath the chandelier's trembling light, two souls laid bare before a world that would never understand them. Then, with the dignity of a man who had chosen his ruin, the Duke offered his arm. "Come," he said softly. "Let us leave before the music begins again," and, together, they walked through the scandalized silence, not as nobility or servant, but as the only honest pair in the room. Autumn came early that year, with fog so thick it seemed to swallow the very world. Ravenscroft Hall stood hollow upon the hill, shutters drawn, hearths cold, its grandeur reduced to an echo. Parliament had concluded its judgment. The title of Duke was stripped, the land seized. Edmund Ravenscroft no longer existed in law or lineage. What remained was only a man, worn, unadorned, and unrepentant. He stood by the window of a modest cottage on the outskirts of Kent, the sort of dwelling no one of his name had ever entered by choice. The fields outside were hushed beneath mist, the sun pale as milk behind the clouds. His hands were rough now, marked not by ink but by labor. For months he had disappeared from London's world entirely. To those who once toasted him, he was dead in all but name. And yet, in that death, he had found something resembling peace. Behind him she moved quietly, setting down a pot of tea. Her hair, once always bound in constraint, now fell loose in the light. There was no governess now, no duke, no scandal, only two souls surviving in a silence they had earned the hard way. But even peace, as she knew, has its debts. He turned to her. "It will be today," he said. "They will come for what remains," she nodded. The Crown's agents would arrive by dusk to take possession of the last parcel of land still in his name, the school they had built together from the remnants of his estate. It was small, no more than a stone hall and garden, but it had become a refuge for children left orphaned by London's cruelty. It was, in truth, all they had left of purpose. "Let them take the land," she said softly. "They cannot take what you have taught," he smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "You sound as though you've forgiven me." "I have," she said, pouring the tea. "But I do not think you've forgiven yourself." He turned back to the window, his voice low. "Forgiveness requires faith. I spent mine long ago." Her hand brushed his. "Then borrow mine." Before he could reply, the sound of hooves broke through the fog, a small procession of riders on the road. The agents had come earlier than expected. She saw the flicker of resolve harden in him, the same steel that had once carried him through Parliament, debates and duels alike. "I will speak to them," he said. "I will go with you." "No," he said firmly, then softened. "You have lost enough for me. Let me bear the rest." But she followed him regardless. The men who dismounted bore no kindness in their faces. Clerks of the Crown, perfumed with authority, their boots still clean from the journey. The leader, a stout man with spectacles and a smug countenance, unfolded the warrant. By order of Her Majesty's Treasury, the remaining assets of the late Duke of Ravenscroft are to be seized for public debt. "The Duke is dead?" Edmund said calmly. "You address a man with no title," the clerk sniffed. "Be that as it may, property answers for the sins of its owner." The governess stepped forward then, her voice sharp enough to cut through the damp air. "And what of the children within? Will your papers shelter them from the cold?" The clerk frowned. "The Crown will make appropriate arrangements." "Appropriate?" she repeated, the word trembling with contempt. "You speak of lives as ledgers." Edmund placed a hand on her arm, steadying her. "Enough," he murmured. Then, turning to the clerk, he said, "Take what you came for, but the children stay. That is my condition." "You are in no position to bargain," the man replied. Edmund's gaze hardened. "You misunderstand. It is not a bargain. It is mercy, a thing I doubt your ink-stained hands remember." The clerk hesitated, unnerved by the quiet authority in his voice. "And if we refuse?" "Then you will have to drag me from this place," Edmund said simply. A standoff hung in the air, thick and taut. The clerk, unwilling to soil his hands, relented. "You may keep your little school until winter's end. After that, it belongs to the Crown." When they rode away, Leaving the road strewn with the echo of hooves, the governess turned to him, her anger softened by sorrow. "You cannot keep defying the world this way. It will break you." He looked at her, really looked, and said, "It already has. But what remains is yours." She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Do not give me ruin, Edmund. Give me peace." He reached into his coat and drew out a small wooden box, time-worn and scarred. "Then take this," he said, handing it to her. Inside lay the white camellia, dried, fragile, but still whole. Beneath it, a folded note. She read it silently. "They took my name, but not the reason I wished to keep it." Her fingers trembled as she closed the lid. "Why show me this now?" "Because I will not ask you to wait for me again," he said. "The crown may strip my home, but they will not strip my pride. I leave tomorrow to serve where they cannot follow. In the colonies, perhaps. They need men who know loss. I will teach them how to bear it." The words hit her like wind to flame. "You mean to leave me?" "I mean to spare you." "No," she said, her voice fierce through the tears. "Do not dress cowardice as mercy." He flinched as if struck. Then, with sudden tenderness, he took her hand and pressed it to his chest. "Listen," he whispered. "It is not cowardice. It is the only way I can love you without destroying what goodness you still have." She drew back, shaking her head. "I do not want goodness. I want you." For a moment he said nothing, then leaned forward and kissed her forehead, slow and solemn, as though sealing a promise neither of them could keep. The next morning he was gone. Only the box remained, the camellia resting in stillness beside her pillow. Years passed. The school grew humble and warm. The children knew her as Madame Ravenscroft, though she never corrected them. Letters came once a year, never signed, but unmistakable in their quiet grace. And one winter morning, as she watched the first snow fall through the window, a messenger arrived with a final note in familiar hand. "Forgive me. I have found peace. It wears your name." She pressed the letter to her heart, the faint scent of camellia rising once more, proof that love, even in ruin, had not been lost, only transformed.